Welcome to Roots of Representation, a podcast series brought to you by Knology, a leading organization creating practical social science for a better world. The podcast series is a part of our larger National Science Foundation funded project called Black Rep for Kids, where we delve into the power of storytelling in helping young Black children prepare for and tackle the challenges of climate change. If you're interested in learning about how we can build a brighter climate future for Black children, their families, and their communities, you've come to the right place. Let's get started with Roots of Representation, the podcast centering Black climate story worlds for young minds.
Welcome to Roots of Representation, Black-centered climate story worlds for young minds. My name is Anthony Frasier, and I'm serving as the guest host for this very special episode of Roots of Representation, an episode in which we get to talk to the regular host, Ed Greene, Dr. Ed Greene, the PI and motive force behind Black Rep for Kids project, behind the Black Rep for Kids project. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with you about this project and what you're learning from it when it comes to improving the representation of Black voices, characters, and stories in children's climate change media. As I mentioned, our guest for the episode is Ed Greene. Ed is a Knology Fellow, and in addition to serving as the PI for the Black Rep for Kids project, he has worked with Knology on a variety of different projects dealing with media literacy, cultural competency, ideation, and transmedia property development. He formerly served as the VP for Children, Youth, and Digital Media Literacy at the Hispanic Information Telecommunications Network, and he was also an instructional leadership coach for principals and pre-K through 12 teachers in Detroit's public schools for TeachGate. He has served as a senior advisor and consultant to CETO USA in his unique approach to early learning and as director of global outreach for Sesame Workshop in Central America, the Andes, Jordan, Kosovo, and India. We've invited you to share what you've been learning and hearing as you're going on this work of building a community of researchers and practitioners dedicated to producing picture books, storybooks, audiobooks, and other forms of popular media that speak to the climate-related needs and concerns of Black audiences. We're particularly interested to know what you see as emerging themes and focus areas within this community, and to get your insights into how collaboration can contribute to the goal of improving Black representation in kids' climate media. To start things off, I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how you came to this work, what got you interested in working in the intersections of children's media, climate change, and STEM education, and what in particular inspired Black Rep for Kids.
Wow, this is great. And
I know that was a mouthful.
That was great, Anthony. And I appreciate being on this particular podcast with you because as part of doing this work and being part of the children's media landscape, having the opportunity to work with you prior to this work, but also to have you as part of the Black Rep for Kids Advisory Committee has been absolutely wonderful. So I come to this work because I have the opportunity to interact with people who are on the ground doing the work like yourself, helping to bring voice to those issues and stories that need to be told. As you said, my background's in early childhood, child development, early learning, children's media environments, and I'm a generalist in those areas. And so I am not a scientist in the climate space, but I am someone who really is involved in how do we help to ensure that what we are wanting children to know and to learn about is done in a way that's developmentally appropriate. In other words, especially for younger kids, how do we represent what we're trying to share with them, teach them, learn from them as they explore the world in ways that are developmentally appropriate. So most of the work that I do is around that, helping people to interpret what they're doing so that it is understandable and appropriate for younger children, but also maps onto a continuum of learning as they age and grow and mature, there are ways in which they see the world that will also grow and mature. So my work in this particular area began as a spark that took place back a few years ago when the National Science Foundation convened a climate science children and media forum. And when they pulled that together, I was not a part of the original forum, but the former CEO of Knology was actually on one of the panels that was part of that particular forum. And it included discussions about how media organizations could collaborate with scientists and scientific bodies to produce more engaging climate centered, STEM focused content for young children. And during that time, the topics in the reviewed materials, in the materials I actually reviewed as a result of that, were what media producers needed to know about communicating climate science was a focus of that particular forum. Another was how to meaningfully engage historically underserved and underrepresented families was part of that. And how do we begin to think about successful science media collaborations? So all of those things were taking place with that NSF forum on climate science, which caught my attention. And I thought, well, this is really great. They're paying attention, especially to the disproportionality issues. At the same time, there were some things that began to happen with the Aspen Institute. This is Planet Ed and Capita created the Early Childhood Climate Task Force, which was really an important, I think, opportunity for people who were working with younger children and family and their families to really begin to think about, well, how do we look at taking child-centered action on climate change, across various sectors. So they pulled
Right.
together a diverse group of organizations to be on this task force. And I happen to have known the National Association for the Education of Young Children was part of that. And I've been a member of that organization for many years. And groups like the National Association of Family Child Care, and then particularly the National Black Child Development Institute was one of the members of this Aspen Institute Early Childhood Climate Task Force. And they identified many of the goals that were part of that larger convening at NBCDI. And so that was another thing that caught my attention that was really important. And then the other piece was I had read some materials about a storybook STEM project that was funded by National Science Foundation, and they were looking at how educators and researchers could advance the use of storybooks as a tool for engaging families in STEM learning. And what was great about that is that one of the project's findings was that children's STEM stories were authored primarily by white middle class individuals. And to ensure that children and families from all communities see themselves, one of their recommendations was we need to broaden the ways in which we give voice to stories and how we bring people to talking about those stories. So, anyway, those are some of the key pieces that caught my attention. And I began to see the need to recognize solution builders who were doing work in this space, because even though there was recognition of the fact that there was disproportionate impact of
Right.
climate on Black and Brown communities, unfortunately, most of those conversations positioned the populations that they were referring to as victims. And clearly, when climate hits you, it doesn't matter who you are, you're a victim of those things that impact you that are a result of climate. But if you don't begin to see yourself as being part of a community of practice or a group of people who are also solution builders, who have the opportunity to sort of address the future, dealing with the challenges, but also dealing with the hope, you don't get as engaged. And I was feeling that there was a need for an opportunity to express the Black representation in climate preparedness discussions in more explicit ways. So anyway, that's how I began to think about how do we pull some people together to see if anyone else thinks that's a problem or a challenge or an
Yeah.
opportunity. And that's sort of how I sort of got involved.
Yeah,
It's more
yeah. I mean,
complicated than that, but that's a start.
yeah, I think you know, solutions aren't one size fits all. And I think that that's what that's the way we've been approaching it
Mm-hmm.
for a long time, is a one size fits all solution, but it doesn't. You know, there are
Mm-hmm.
cultural differences, there are regional differences, there are just racial differences. All of these things matter when it comes to crafting solutions for climate change and telling stories around climate change. And yeah, I think it's really important. So I think it's great that you recognize the opportunity to jump in and become that catalyst for change. So, but one of the key parts of the project so far has actually been this podcast series, which we're making to create a foundation for interdisciplinary conversations around climate change. So, children's media and Black communities. The podcast series has an intriguing title, Roots of Representation. And I've always wondered, what's the idea behind that title? It's very, it gets to the heart of it. You're using the roots of representation. And when you think about science, you don't,
Mm-hmm.
that's like a name that's far from scientific. So like, how did you come up with that name, and what's the foundation of it?
Well, I think this is really really great. One of the deliverables for this project that was written into the proposal was that we would have multiple ways of sort of begin to ask people questions that helped us to understand what's involved in getting more voices and people engaged. And with this roots of representation idea, we knew that we had a very strong group of individuals who were a part of our leadership and advisory team, you being one of those. And we wanted to also begin to take the perspectives that were being brought from the behavioral and mental health field, from the informal science learning field, from storybook and story world creators like yourself and other people who are doing children's storybooks, and asking them, what do you think about the ways in which we bring stories of the world to children, and particularly engaging children in the work in a way that will help them to understand the context, but also help the people who are creating those particular books understand it. So I had this whole belief about if you can see it, you can believe, you can be it. So the title of the podcast really reflects the important role that representational practices can actually play in empowering communities, and particularly in minoritized communities, and also increasing racial equity. And when we think about representation, we guided by this idea: if you can see it, you can be it. What's on the page, or what's in the themes, or what's in the protagonist's approach to whatever they're doing. So when Black children see themselves, their realities, their situations, their hopes, their dreams represented in different media, they're empowered to sort of recognize their intrinsic human values and their value as human beings. And when they identify the characters and the stories they encounter, they gain a sense of belonging. And hopefully, this is also something that's tied to how we think about relatable characters, or characters that share backgrounds or live in spaces that look similar to where one might live. Um, and then they gain the ability to imagine themselves in either those roles, either as helpers in the communities, or people who are thinking about ways of problem solving. And so their ambitions get ignited, and they're encouraged to confront these various issues. And effective representation then becomes part of this discussion. And because it can do all of those things. So we called the podcast Roots of Representation because we were interested in what makes for effective Black representation in children's media. And because this is an inquiry-based project, we weren't coming to it and saying we already know what that is, because we don't. And as we began to work on how we would bring different voices to sort of discuss this notion of what makes for effective representation, you were particularly helpful in this because of the work that you do on a day-to-day basis to say, well, how do we sort of shape this and bring it together? So what happened was we began to think about each one of our advisory team members, what they could bring, how they could talk about roots of representation from the standpoint of Black-centered climate story worlds. And then we said, well, maybe one of the things that we could do is actually um, theme theme the podcast in such a way that each person would be seen as bringing a part of a root, a grounding, literally, thinking about this whole notion of how do you look at providing the foundation. So roots of representation are the foundations of these things that we think make for effective Black representation.
Yeah.
And so we put those two things together. And I think as we were beginning to write the production model for this, and my conversations with you, we just sort of said, well, this is rooted in some good work. So let's just begin to think about this as an opportunity to talk about roots of representation.
Yeah.
Philosophically speaking, that's sort of where it came from. But in concrete, it really has to do with those
Yeah.
particular principles that are associated with how we can nurture our conversations.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I
that's
love
sort
that.
of a quick and dirty way of looking at how we came up with that.
Yeah, I love the name. It reminds me symbolically. I think it's a good name because we're just planting seeds right now, and like you said, the hope is for those seeds to grow into larger, meaningful, impactful, long term. Because you put a tree there, and trees don't go away unless you cut them down.
There we
And
go.
so trees,
Well, yeah,
the weather won't get rid of a tree. Sometimes, sometimes it takes a lot of a wind, and so it's just grounded. But it starts from the roots.
well, I think you've hit on another key piece, Anthony, because as I work with our team and with the advisory committee, I really sort of grew in my own way of thinking about how we can be more effective in talking about the story world creation. And so I began to put some terms together. Not that they were um, you know uh, proven to be the best way to talk about this, but just like you were talking about the planting of the tree. So I began to think about nourishment. Just as roots absorb essential nutrients from the soil,
Right.
diverse narratives provide children with the cultural and historical knowledge that's necessary for
Right.
understanding their identities in the world around them. So, nourishment is one of
Right.
the things that Black Rep for Kids and the podcast do.
Right.
Stability, roots provide an anchor plants,
Right.
ensuring that they sort of remain upright and resilient. But similarly, well represented story worlds give children a sense of belonging and
Yeah.
security and allowing them to navigate their environments. And then growth.
Right.
Roots facilitate growth by drawing water and nutrients from the soil
Right.
to sort of allow the plant to flourish. And in the same way, inclusive story worlds can foster like imagination and creativity in children and encourage them to explore new ideas and
Right.
perspectives. And then connection. Roots often have tendrils and they intertwine with each other, and they create a network that supports an entire ecosystem, to keep
Yeah.
things alive. And this mirrors how, like, the interconnected stories promote empathy and understanding and helping children relate to diverse experiences. And then there's adaptability, which is tied to this whole climate change piece of, adaptation versus mitigation. Well, adaptation, roots can spread and adapt to changing environments, and that can ensure the survival of the plant. But similarly, flexible story worlds can evolve to reflect the changing dynamics of society, teaching children the importance of adaptability in a complex world. So I share those with you, not as saying those are the correct ways to look at the basis of this roots of representation. But I think, as it turned out, as we interviewed and brought each of the members of the advisory team to their episodes, those are the kinds of things that began to happen to me. I felt nurtured. I felt more connected. I felt that I was growing and learning. So hopefully the people who are experiencing the podcast will also benefit from that approach to roots of representation.
And speaking of those episodes, those interviews you've had, you've interviewed a lot of different people from many different walks of life. What has the podcast series taught you about the roots of representation? That is, when it comes to creating stories and story worlds that amplify and improve the representation of Black voices in children's climate media, what are you seeing as the key building blocks or essential elements for those stories? What are the key steps to effective Black representation for content creators?
Well, one of the things that happened to me, Anthony, was that the ideas, the experiences, and the background that each of you, as advisory committee members, brought to this really sort of further improved my enthusiasm. Not that takes a lot, because if I get excited about something, I can do that. But the exposure to the different ways in which people were involved in doing work allowed me to continue to take essential elements of what people were saying and tie them into uh, mutually beneficial opportunities that are recognized as advantageous when discussing the project itself. I mean, that's one of the things that really helped me. It helped me to sort of really bring bring together some of the ideas that we were thinking were important. And it wasn't just about the melting of the glaciers and the rising of the oceans, but how are people impacted from the standpoint of their families or their communities? So I began to think a little bit more about the behavioral and mental health issues that are needed to be addressed, so that we can address difficult situations, but bring people to the table who have those background, have knowledge and background in social and emotional development and behavioral and mental health, along with people who create story worlds and put them side by side with each other. Because as I began to listen to more and more of the podcasts after we produced them, I was saying, wow, you put this diverse collection of minds in the room to think about a topic, so that we can talk about the serious issues, but also talk about how do we think about things that help us to think about a possible future. So Black futurity is a piece that sort of came out of it for me. We're talking about how we can think about a future, or as we become more engaged and more knowledgeable and know that there are solutions builders, there are people who are actually doing the work, like some of the members of the advisory committee who are already doing work in the children's environmental awareness space. So it allowed me to really see that coming together to have this conversation across disciplines, across different backgrounds of professional knowledge, including media, was really going to be an important part of our ongoing project. So that's sort of what happened to me as I became involved in that whole process and getting to learn about people and their backgrounds.
And it really is a diverse group. You have people from the publishing industry, you have people from the informal learning community, you have people from the early childhood education research backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
Some are climate researchers. Some are people who just study the media. What's it been like bringing together such a huge, diverse group of researchers and practitioners who can collaborate to stimulate and guide the production of climate media that addresses the needs and concerns of Black kids, their families, and their communities? How have people responded to the Black Rep for Kids initiative, and what kind of reception does the project generally meet when you talk to people about it?
Well, what's really interesting is that there are communities of people who are involved in this work that are in different sectors, and so there are people from the nature education side of things who are doing really
Mm.
great stuff in helping kids to understand the world around them and nature, which is foundational. But when you ask them, well, to what extent are you engaged in um, working with populations that are disproportionately impacted by climate change? And how are they represented in your discussions or your resource materials or whatever? There were oftentimes um, a great deal of interest in, well, we want to learn more about that. We want to be able to do that because there wasn't necessarily a lot out there that
Right.
did include these diverse voices, whether we're talking about diverse disciplines or people from diverse backgrounds or people from those communities themselves that were disproportionately impacted. What I found was many people began to have ahas because initially when
Mm.
you say Black Rep for Kids, it's sort of like, okay, now why do we have to look at Black kids? Well, if you look at what NOAA and the EPA and all of these groups say about the disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities, but the follow-up from these particular events don't oftentimes have materials and experiences that reflect those communities. Sometimes the people see themselves only as the victims. They don't see themselves as doing things. So I began, as a result of this project, people would turn me on to things that I would then include in my conversations. Like I shared with the advisory committee this woman that I learned about, Heather McTeer Toney, incredible person, but she released a book in 2023 called Before the Streetlights Come On. Now,
Mm.
that in and of itself has a cultural context because I grew up outside of Detroit, okay?
Right.
And when it got dark at night,
Gotta
all
go
of the
in.
adults said, look, you better be home before the streetlights come on.
Right.
Well, it was sort of like a wake up call, get home because it's not that you're going to be harmed necessarily, but things start happening after it gets dark. Well, she wrote a book called Before the Streetlights Come On, and used that as a way to develop what she called Black America's urgent call for climate solutions.
Mm.
So when I could share what I was getting access to around people who were doing work and who were solutions builders and also happened to be African American, people were saying, wow, I didn't know she existed.
Right.
Now, here
Yeah.
are people in the same space looking at climate and environment. But then when I would share something, and I'll do this like I did with people like Heather McTeer Toney, as I learned from the advisory committee, there were some people who actually knew who she was, but there were other people who did not. But she
Right.
is an African American attorney, an environmentalist. She was the first Black female and youngest mayor of Greenville, Mississippi, when she was
Mm.
27.
Oh wow.
She was appointed by President Barack Obama as the regional administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency's Southeast region. She was the former senior director for Moms Fresh Clean Air, which is a very active group around the issues of environment. She was she was vice president of community engagement for the Environmental Defense Fund. And she now leads the work um, that is really being focusing on the Bloomberg Philanthropies Beyond Petrochemicals campaign.
Okay.
Now that's just Heather McTeer Toney. But
Right.
then I began to hear about other people like her mentors, Beverly Wright, who leads an incredible institution, which up until the time that we began to do our work at Black Rep for Kids, I didn't really have an understanding that there was something like this that existed, and it's called the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. It's the first ever environmental justice center in the United States, headed by Dr. Beverly Wright, an
Right.
African American woman who's. So I guess what I'm saying is that
Right.
as we began our discussions as an advisory committee and we began to look at the tasks that we had at looking at really what are the opportunities for Black representation, there were all of these ahas. People wanted to learn more. Tell me more,
Right.
was the response that I generally got from people.
Right.
And that was just in the beginning of us trying to figure out, okay, so how do we keep the discussion going and bring more people to it across these different backgrounds?
Right. Have you faced any challenges or roadblocks or obstacles when talking about Black rep for kids? I mean, you mentioned using the word, Black and focusing on Black kids. Has there been, and unfortunately, some of these things get political when it's not political. It's very scientific. But because they hear the word Black and you're focusing on Black kids, you'd mention it like, oh, why Black kids, right? And some of those things can kind of derail the conversation.
Yes.
Have you faced anything like that? And like, what have been some ways you've been able to like move around and cut through the noise and really just get people to focus on the science?
Yeah. Yes. In some instances, I have really faced the question, well, why do we need to focus on that?
Right.
And what I often tried to do was just to go to the data. So, for example, when Hurricane Katrina hit years and years ago, we knew that many people were impacted. But when you look at the data that were reported about who was impacted, who was displaced, what happened to them,
Right.
I try to talk about it from the standpoint of, there were lots of people from all different backgrounds, but there were disproportionate numbers of people who were impacted. What happened to them, and what happened to the children?
Right.
I said, my goal is we want to make sure that we have, the health and well-being of children top of mind, regardless of who they are. But when you're disproportionately impacted, it can cause some difficulties, especially when there's limited access to services. So I tried to move in that direction whenever there was pushback. But for the most part, people were fascinated by the fact that I would use the term disproportionately impacted. But they were saying, but everybody's impacted for climate change. Yes, but why are some communities impacted more than others? And then we talk about redlining, were people aware of that? Now, in some instances, I didn't even get that far because, you just really want people to understand this is about how do we have all children represented in the conversation.
Right.
And that's really the focus that I tried to be on at
Right.
that point. But we had to be careful in some instances in terms of how we talked about this because there are red flags. You have to remember that there was a time when any mention of anything having to do with diverse communities or equitable impact, access to services, those words in and of themselves were in some instances eliminated from the the vocabularies of different parts of the funding streams in the federal government. So, I mean, it's not that we're trying to do anything hidden. It's just that we're trying to say, okay, we want everyone to be the beneficiaries of ways in which our lives can be improved. So that's how I've had to go. But we've really had people come to the table who we did not even expect. A former colleague of mine, when she heard about the project, a former colleague of mine who worked at Sesame Workshop, had begun to become involved in a project in New York City that was in conjunction with the look at communities that did not have certain communities that did not have trees that made it even more difficult for those communities to have shade, which also is related to heat and some of those other issues. And they came up with a project called 17 Trees that involved diverse communities who were talking about how can we plant more trees? So we tried to begin to pay attention to folks who were doing things But there were also people who were hearing what we were doing who said, "Oh my gosh, can you tell me a little bit more about what you're doing?" Because we just did
Right.
a storybook called 17 Trees, to be precise, and it's about this community action that we were doing with a diverse group of community members about planting more trees.
Right.
So there was a mix, but I think it was all, for the most part, very
Right.
positive.
Perfect, perfect. And look, you've interviewed a lot of people during this podcast, and what are you seeing in terms of common themes, common questions and concerns, and shared areas of interest? Like, what are some of the big emerging focal points you're seeing through these discussions? Are there particular topics you think the community really needs to tackle versus others?
Well, I think for the most part, there's been I think consistency in the ways in which people have observed the need to address the different types of community-based concerns, whether it's health, whether it's access to uh, materials that give them more information just about who they are and in that community and what they need to be thrivers and not just survivors. Um, and how do we address the fact that sometimes we are put in a position where we're made to feel that we don't belong in the conversation. And so everyone, I think, that has been a part of the podcast that says that there are things that we have to do to continue to help people to develop self-efficacy, particularly if you're involved in all these different ways in which populations such as African American communities are disproportionately impacted by health related issues, by other. So you have all of these things, and now climate. So I think that what we did here was is the fact that it feels like it's yet one more thing
Right.
that we have to address. But when you stop and think about it, because it cuts across so many different needs, self-efficacy is something that we have to build among members of our own communities to be a part of the larger conversations that are going on about beginning to bring about a difference in the communities where we live around climate. But I
Right.
think for the most part, uh, this whole notion of different disciplines coming together. I mean, when the
Right.
mental health people are also talking to the climate scientists and are also talking to the people who are doing informal learning, whether it's through family night events at libraries
Right.
or through maker spaces and other exhibitions at children's museums that reach out in the communities to say, you're represented in this as well. These are community
Right.
conversations that we need to be having. So I think that those are some of the elements that tend to bring people together. Clearly, we have to look at how we are impacted by laws and by the ways in which planning goes on in communities. All
Right.
of those things have to be taken into consideration. But I think it's more of a can-do attitude that's
Right.
um, been really discussed, and people just revealing that there are things going on that are making a difference in the lives of communities and helping folks to know that there are resources to tap.
Right.
Just like, for example, if you're going to talk about the appreciation of the needs around climate change, there's also a need to have an appreciation of nature. So, what do we do just to do that? And so I've come to know in some of my interviews and talking to people that there are people doing work like that, like this woman, Rue Map is the creator of Outdoor Afro. Outdoor Afro, what is that? Well, this is an organization that's been around for 20, 30 years. And they're looking at things that are related to how people are engaged in nature and have been for many, many years. And she wrote a book about the stories and visions of Black joy in the outdoors. And they're
Mm,
essays that are from people who have been involved in looking at how they interact in the environment and how they have other people who are becoming involved in that same work who are also now crossing over or becoming more engaged in the issues around climate that impact Black
right,
communities, Black children, what have you. So those are the kinds of things. It's been more of an optimistic approach to making a difference that each
right.
of the interviews led me to. As we talked, it led me to feel that people are knowing their challenges, but they're also looking at opportunities and not just looking at victimization, but also
Right.
looking at the fact that we can build community and we can build a sense of self-efficacy in the work that we need to do, and to look at solution builders who are doing things like a Heather McTeer Tony,
Right.
so we can be I think really a part of a renewal as a result of this Black Rep for Kids project, in my mind, if we can keep that energy going.
Yeah. And what do you see as this, like, as the end product? Like, what's your ultimate vision for how this work can progress and grow? If you look 5 or 10 years down the road, what would you like to see as the impact or legacy of this project? What would success look like?
Well, I think one of the outcomes of this particular project, which includes this unconference where we're bringing people together to actually have some more conversations about what is this Black representation that we're talking about, what are the roots of this, that we can begin to create some guiding principles or ideas for story creators. So we're hoping that the proceedings from this particular unconference will result in some key ideas that people can use in their story world creation. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we're hoping that people will understand that when you're working with younger children, they're not able necessarily to capture all of those things associated with the melting of the glaciers and the rising of the ocean, but they can become more engaged in understanding the world around them, nature, that the ways in which we contribute to supporting nature. Because if we don't do that, it's going to be difficult to have people to become interested in, saving the planet from climate change.
Right.
So I'm hoping that one of the other things that happens is that we begin to build a pipeline of knowledge, skills, and understandings that start with the youngest in ways that are developmentally appropriate, that help them to understand the ways in which they are part of this world, and help the adults who work with them, whether they're parents or caregivers, to do that. But beyond that, I'm hoping that we're going to be building some more cross-disciplinary, cross-generational, cross-geographical, and cross-national collaborations.
Right.
And I use that as a frame of mind because as we put this project together, we were saying, okay, how can we bring voices together that generally exist in silos? People are doing a lot
Mm,
of good work in
right.
silos. But when we come out of the silos and we share, across these different disciplines, whether it's behavioral and mental health, or whether it's, people who are involved in early childhood education or and what have you. And when we begin to build on the strengths of a cross generational understanding, that's going to be, something that I think will be helpful, because we can't put all of the responsibility for making something happen on the young people just because they're young and they
Right.
have more years than we do.
Right.
We also have to come to the table with the knowledge, skills, and wisdom and listen to what young people are bringing to the table, and seeing if there are ways that cross-generational conversation can help create new ways of being, create new
Right.
approaches to self-efficacy. So I think for the most part, I really want to see that kind of longer term approach to working across these different groups and bringing
Right.
people out of silos so that we really can address the issues that are top of
Right.
mind. And we're dealing with climate change. So that's one thing that everybody's involved in. But we can't solve the problem if we're all in our own silos having a conversation
Exactly.
with ourselves.
That's true. That's true. And before we let you go, you gave us a lot of individuals that we never heard of before who are doing great work, who we should know about. Is there anyone else? Is there any other individuals, groups, or resources you know about that we should all be aware of? If there are people or organizations contributing to environmental and climate solutions that connect with this work, please do let us know.
Well, one of the exciting things, Anthony, is that the way in which we've built our project um, includes an opportunity to bring and curate knowledge and resources. So, one of the things that we can do is make sure that everyone makes use of our website and
Mhm.
particularly our resource library. And many of the things that we've been talking about today and that have been contributed by our advisory committee and by people who have come to know us have contributed to that. So, a few things I would like to pull out, though. I met a young man who had been doing some work. His name is Zanagi Artis. And he co founded an organization called This Is Zero Hour. And I think I want people to know more about This Is Zero Hour because its task, and all of these people were basically under 30 when they started this, is to center the voices of diverse youth in the conversation around climate and environmental justice. And so it's a youth led movement. They have resources and training and young activists and organizers who are actually supporting this vision of taking concrete action. So there are people like Zanagi Artis and This Is Zero Hour. Clearly, I would love for people to make sure that they check out Outdoor Afro and Rue Map and the work that she's done. She has created an organization that really celebrates and inspires Black connections and leadership in those connections in nature. She's also written a book called Nature Swagger, which is an
Mm.
incredible book of essays that deal with these stories and visions of Black joy and, participation in the out of doors. The Children's Trust, our Children's Trust, is a nonprofit public interest law firm that is providing these strategic campaign-based services to youth from diverse backgrounds. And it's all focused on how do we protect the earth and how do we bring young people together to take that to legislatures, to community-based organizations. So our Children's Trust is drawing on young people, and they need folks to support. So that's one thing we should begin to do. Bloomberg's philanthropy has this Beyond Petrochemicals campaign. And this is something that Heather McTeer Toney is involved in. And it was launched by Mike Bloomberg in 2022 to stop the expansion of petrochemical facilities, many of which are adjacent to Black communities.
Mm.
But this is being headed by Heather McTeer Toney. So we should check out what she's doing, and then clearly the work of Beverly Wright at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. When we talk about climate change, climate justice, environmental change and justice, that is different from talking about environmental and climate education. Because when you're talking about education, you're talking about the basic facts that are related to things that we should know. But when you talk about justice, you're talking about, and how do we begin to balance the inequities with the solutions that we're trying to create. So I think that the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice is one. And then Robert Bullard, he is known among some people as the father of environmental justice. African American man who leads the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at Texas Southern University. And so those are just some of the resources. But people should go to Black Rep for Kids website, to the resource library. It's now set up. The team at Knology has done an incredible job in taking the information and resources and guidance of the advisory and leadership team and made this a living resource library.
Nice.
And so there are many, many more things that can be discovered there, along with our podcasts, which will be, I think, a great incentive for people to continue to think more about how they establish their own roots of representation in their work.
Well, this is unfortunately the end of the podcast. I like to thank you for the work that you're doing in the community, the work you've been doing to mentor me personally, bringing me into this community. I would have never been doing the work that I'm doing in the community if you didn't bring it to me directly and really express to me the void that children's media has, especially when it's targeting, Black and brown youth around climate change. And so you've definitely inspired me and inspired the work that I'm doing. And so I really appreciate that. And you provided us with some essential information today, perspectives to think about as we build our STEM-related knowledge into children's climate media change literature and hands-on experiences. So once again, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you as the project continues.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be on with you today. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Roots of Representation. If you'd like to comment on this episode, please head over to blackrepforkids.knology.org. Our website also contains free resources and more information about the project, which is led by Knology in collaboration with the Highlights Foundation, the National Black Child Development Institute, the Association of Children's Museums, and a panel of nationally recognized advisors. Remember, Black Rep for Kids isn't just a podcast. It's an essential part of the project's culminating experience, which will be a 2-day unconference event held in fall 2024. Head over to the website to register now. And in the meantime, let's keep the conversation going. You can also share your ideas and resources for amplifying Black voices and stories in children's STEM literature at blackrepforkids.knology.org. Roots of Representation is produced by ABF Creative, an award-winning podcast network that creates cultural and emotional connections through podcasts. The series is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program under grant number 2314101. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this podcast series are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. Roots of Representation, the podcast centering Black climate story worlds for young minds.